I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is UN Insider.
Coming up.
There are no winners in this war. Instead, it is marked by loss and agony, with civilians bearing the heaviest burden.
Renewed calls for an end to the conflict in the Middle East as international pressure for a ceasefire intensifies.
It's a very intense campaign. You want to do it as quickly as possible, over at least number of days as possible.
A massive vaccination effort launches in Gaza after the territory's first confirmed case of polio in 25 years.
You cannot tackle these goals and these targets, the SDG targets, one by one. You've got to look at where they cluster.
Finding connections that could lead to a more sustainable future. A conversation on the intersection of climate change, poverty, and hunger. Next.
There is mounting pressure for a deal to end the fighting between Israel and Hamas and free the remaining hostages. It comes after the bodies of 6 people taken captive last year on October 7th were found inside Gaza. Jody Jacobs has the details.
It was another intense session of the UN Security Council. The meeting was requested by Israel after the bodies of 6 hostages killed in Gaza were recovered last weekend. There were calls, some heated, in the council chamber for an immediate ceasefire to end the suffering of the hostages being held by Hamas and the Palestinian people. Several countries stressed the importance of upholding international law, with Algeria's ambassador Amer Benyami saying that the council is at an inflection point and is faced with a test that will define the international world order and protect the multilateral system. China says it is imperative that the council redoubles its efforts to bring an end to the fighting. It says despite repeated international efforts and calls for a ceasefire, there is still no sign of easing or de-escalation.
This war has been raging for too long. Ceasefire negotiations have been delayed for too long, and the suffering of the population has persisted for too long. Time to put an end to it all. We support the Security Council taking further actions geared towards implementing the relevant Council resolutions, putting out the flames of war without delay, and alleviating its humanitarian fallout.
Wednesday's meeting took place against the backdrop of ongoing ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas, facilitated by Egypt, Qatar, and the US.
We cannot lose patience with diplomacy. Diplomacy is not a matter of snapping our fingers and voila. It takes hard work. It takes effort. And unfortunately, it takes time. It has not failed.
The United Nations says a ceasefire is imperative. It remains convinced that peace will only be achieved when Israel and a sovereign Palestinian state live side by side within secure and recognized borders. Jody Jacobs, CGTN, New York.
From the Security Council to the briefing room and beyond, Shu Dija is monitoring the latest developments inside the UN. Dija.
Yes, Elaine, this is a rather short week in the United Nations headquarters. But here we are, September, the big month for once a year high-level week. Starting this week, Slovenia assumes presidency of the Security Council, and during high-level week, the Council will host an open debate called Leadership for Peace, where President Zelensky of Ukraine and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel both participate in the debate.
Do you expect both President Zelensky or maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu to be in the Security Council meetings during AGA week?
We are open for the big debate on 25th. Everybody is invited, so we don't have indications whether the 2 leaders that you mentioned will participate. Both of them will be welcome.
But that's 2 weeks away. We will keep an eye on it. For this week, our focus is on the Security Council meeting on Middle East. It was held on Wednesday, and this is a very special meeting. Normally, Security Council meeting about Gaza or Palestine was requested by one party, but this time, Israel, supported by US, UK, and France, and Algeria, requested Security Council meeting separately. We all know how fierce and confrontational the meetings about Palestine were. So, as president of Security Council, Ambassador Samuel Zgogar of Slovenia made this plea in advance.
I would like to remind everyone that this is an official meeting of the UN Security Council. Being fully aware that today's briefing is emotionally not an easy one for anyone in the room, I would like to particularly remind all participants and speakers at today's discussion to engage in this meeting with utmost respect and to observe appropriate standards of tone, wording, and context in their remarks.
For Palestinian Ambassador, Mr. Riyad Mansour again called international community to choose the right side.
You are either on the side of the arsonists or the firefighters. You cannot be on both sides. You cannot claim you want to extinguish the fire while providing what fuels it. You have to choose.
And Israeli Ambassador Mr. Danny Danon urged Security Council to adopt a resolution that designates Hamas as a terrorist group.
If you truly cared for the Palestinian people and truly wanted to achieve an end to this war that Hamas started, you would officially draft and pass a resolution designating Hamas as a terrorist organization and condemning Hamas for their hostage-taking.
Well, before the meeting, right here, Ambassador Danon also answered my question. No matter deal or no deal, Hamas will be eliminated. Then why will Hamas agree to the deal? Take a listen.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has spoken many times that the target for the military operation in Gaza is to eliminate the capacity of Hamas. While you're still having the negotiation with Hamas, can you elaborate a little bit why Hamas would engage a negotiation that even they had a deal, they were still doomed to be eliminated?
No, for the future of Gaza and the future of Israel, Hamas will not be in presence in the near future. We are moving. We are achieving our goals. But at the same time, we cannot leave behind the hostages. It's a part of the Jewish value to pray and to do whatever we can to release hostages. And that's why we are actually not negotiating directly with them. We do it through the US, Qatar, and Egypt. But we know that we are sending messages to Hamas because we see the faces of the hostages in front of our eyes every day.
We also ask other ambassadors how frustrated they are on current situation.
How's the ceasefire deal now?
We're still working on it.
Still working on it. Is there a time frame?
10 months. And they're up on diplomacy.
Ambassador, how much frustration do you have for the current situation in Gaza? Rated 1 to 10.
Very much. Very big.
From 1 to 10. Now, what is the number for you?
75.
Why? Oh, 75? So
Why? Because we have 2 resolutions. They're not being implemented. We meet where we're all in agreement that something needs to be done. I think even the countries that have requested today's meeting, Israel and Algeria, we're not on opposite sides. We agree.
Well, that's all from me. Elaine.
Shudija, thanks. The WHO, UNICEF, and other agencies are working with Palestinian health authorities to stop the spread of polio inside Gaza. A massive vaccination campaign kicked off Sunday. Aid workers are trying to immunize more than 600,000 children against the potentially deadly virus. And they are doing it during a series of humanitarian pauses in the fighting.
There's actually 2 campaigns. We started now the first round, and the second round will be in 4 weeks' time. We need to cover minimum of 90% of those children to stop the transmission within Gaza and to avoid polio spread, international spread to polio to surrounding countries.
So far, aid workers have vaccinated more children than expected in the first few days. But challenges remain. In some places, there are concerns about whether heavily damaged infrastructure and security issues could present obstacles for both aid workers and parents trying to get their children to vaccination sites.
We have some areas in these so-called humanitarian pause zones, which means between the hours of 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. there needs to be no fighting and temporary ceasing in fighting. But outside of these zones, of course, and still in the middle area, we are still struggling to get access to facilities and access to families and children in those areas.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres wrapped up his trip to Asia and the South Pacific this week with a visit to China. Guterres met with Chinese leaders and attended the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing. This year's theme focused on advancing modernization on the African continent.
China's remarkable record of development, including on eradicating poverty, provides a wealth of experience and expertise. And the China-Africa Partnership can drive the renewable energy revolution. It can be a catalyst for key transitions on food systems and digital connectivity, and as home to some of the world's most dynamic economies, Africa can maximize the potential of China's support in areas from trade to data management, finance, and technology.
The UN recently observed the International Day for People of African Descent. It celebrates the African diaspora and highlights efforts to eliminate all forms of discrimination. In the Americas, more than 200 million people identify as being of African descent, and Brazil is home to the largest diaspora outside the African continent. More than 50% of the country's population identifies as Black. The government sees the inclusion of Black, Indigenous, and other minority groups as key to achieving the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now the country is calling for a new goal, SDG 18, Ethnic Racial Equality in the 2030 Agenda. I spoke with Roberto Eugenio, Executive Secretary of Brazil's Ministry of Racial Equality.
I think that with regard to the role of the international community in establishing an 18th objective, for us, it is important to highlight that this debate on the importance of including the 18th objective has been carried out by civil society, by social movements, as well as it has been a part of the report on combating discrimination and xenophobia promoted by the UN in 2020. It was pointed out that despite the 17 development goals reflecting the importance of progress in agendas for the sustainable development of the planet, taking diversity into account, there was, as I said, a gap when we were going to be able to check how these targets would effectively reflect equality aimed at the ethnic racial diversity. When we think about SDG 18, which is about the SDG on racial equality, it is possible that we are talking about an SDG that also contributes to the international community making progress on the other 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Coming up.
Something like 97% of people put the climate issue as the highest priority to be dealt with in their lifetime and for their children.
UN Insider.
Climate change, poverty, and hunger. They are three of the biggest global challenges, and they are often interconnected. I sat down with Connie Wignaraja to talk about the impact of those key issues in the Asia-Pacific region. She is UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP's Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. Connie, let's begin with this recent report. People and Planet addressing the interlinked challenges of climate change, poverty, and hunger in Asia and the Pacific. The title sounds very self-explanatory, but what do people need to know right now?
You know, the reason, Elaine, we went with this connecting three big areas together is we saw our research was bringing out a lot of contrarian evidence on the Asia-Pacific. So on the one hand, you probably have the most dynamic region in terms of GDP growth, adult literacy, you see infant mortality dropping, more kids in school. Now with all of that, and 1.5 billion people lifted out of extreme poverty. At the same time, so it's not a but, it's a and, you see climate regression. Right? You see the largest number of natural disasters creating the most destruction across the world in this region. Right? You see the inability to close gender gaps, women and girls falling even further behind. And with an aging population, the worry that we're not spending enough on health, education, social security, while the cost of debt is going up. So it was because of trying to see where are those interlinking points that can trigger big transformation and change that we decided to go with this report.
So let's begin with climate change. How is that compounding into other crises in the region, especially when you have vulnerable regions, vulnerable areas and populations?
You know, if I just look at over the last 2 decades, we're seeing, I would say, losses that account for about $450 billion. So just think, how are we going to recoup this investment? And at the same time, only about 8% of climate financing in the Asia and Pacific go actually into adaptation. So we are obviously seeing the displacement, right? It's something like 1.6 billion people impacted directly by floods alone in our region. That's about 90% of the global total of those impacted. And yet, why isn't money moving towards this area? So we had to look at some of the connectors of saying, what is it that'll change the way we produce, we consume? Agriculture and industry will have to adjust to climate. And interestingly, UNDP ran a global climate vote recently. Something like 97% of people put the climate issue as the highest priority to be dealt with in their lifetime and for their children. And this goes from China to Afghanistan to Tuvalu.
What have been the main challenges when it comes to development, economic growth, and job creation in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, let me take one right off the top, which is about 1.3 billion workers live in our informal sector and live off of our informal sector with no legal safeguards, right? No guarantee of what tomorrow will bring. So a big change has to be, it's not about formalizing the informal sector, it's about putting legal protections and providing the necessary benefits to informal sector workers. Now, that's a lot of them are women, including in the care economy. As you know, the care economy is unpaid work, and yet is a large part, in particular with an aging population in a number of our countries. So this is something that's going to be a significant area. A second is a rethink on debt. The debt burden swallows a country's fiscal space. So a number of Asian countries, I would say, spend over half, or at least 1/3, of their national income on paying interest on debt. That's more than what they spend on public education and health put together. So this is not sustainable. And finally, in our region, sadly, the fallback on the role of women, respect, agency, leadership, and the ability to earn equal pay for equal work, we're not there yet.
You were recently in China. Can you tell us about the visit and some of the key takeaways and observations that you made during your time there?
So quite a few things. I have visited China. My first visit, I think, was out of graduate school in the early 1990s. I have seen significant change in how China is moving along a path of progress. Again, learning hard lessons, because for years, maybe trying some of the same recipes for development. Yes, eliminating extreme poverty and GDP growing. Now you see much more of an effort, for example, on rural revitalization. How do you push out progress that is more sustainable into rural areas of China where large numbers live? So that's a big change. The second is combining climate action with biodiversity protection and nature solutions. These were done separately before. And I think China is showing that if you're going to move on a low carbon pathway, you've got to bring these together and really invest across these elements. And a third, to me, with an aging population, is that there has to be and is now increasingly more support for older people in terms of social services, social security, pension benefits, housing, so you don't leave old people behind. And so these are some of the areas in a more kind of a more equal and sustainable prosperity that we were seeing and I was seeing, and hopefully the UN and UNDP is contributing to in China's new pathways forward.
Do you see things that can be applied in other countries in the region or other regions of the world as one of the bigger countries in the neighborhood, so to speak?
Absolutely. I mean, if I look from the Asia Pacific, I think countries like China, like India, like Indonesia, owe it to the world to bring their lessons, bring the technologies they have developed, whether that's for electric vehicles, for hydrogen, for other sources of renewables, new financing instruments. You know, these are not just debtor countries, these are creditor countries. And so providing more affordable credit and at the same time sharing their experience. China, India, Indonesia, these are countries that are big test laboratories for new development pathways. If it works at scale in these countries, my goodness, it can be applied anywhere in the world.
Connie Wignaraja, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up.
We take the air we breathe for granted, and it's really interesting digging deeper into the idea of like, what is our air quality like?
UN Insider.
All you need to know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
From smog outside to smoke inside, air pollution is the biggest environmental health risk of our time. Air quality is closely linked to the Earth's climate and can cause economic losses and reduce agricultural productivity. The World Health Organization says 99% of the global population breathes air that contains high levels of pollutants.
going outside, we take the air we breathe for granted. And it's really interesting digging deeper into the idea of like, what is our air quality like and like what it looks like every day. It really changes just in general the way I look at life.
Living in one of America's most polluted cities, today the class is learning about air quality.
We use a model of education that's called expeditionary learning. Students are connecting what they're learning in each of their classes and going out to do field work in the city to learn from their environment. Also, we bring in expert speakers to support students learning in the classroom. And at the end of an expedition, students present their learning to an authentic, real audience in what we call a presentation of learning. Students designed their own questions after learning about issues related to air quality.
Yeah, let's try to retake the photos maybe and see what happens.
Go ahead and tell us what colors are those circles that you're seeing?
I'm seeing green.
You are seeing green? Do you see what numbers are you getting?
Yeah, it's 0, and that kind of means that like the air quality is satisfactory.
Wow.
Air pollution poses little to no risk with 24 hours of exposure.
Something that surprised me about the project was like the big difference between the Manhattan borough and the Bronx borough, because I go to school here in the Manhattan for the first time, but I don't live here, I live in the Bronx. And something that I noticed was that like because of like the smoking rates, like where I live, you can see cigarettes on the floor like everywhere. It's not unusual. And there's like buildings that are really close together, and there's factories near my house. So that can cause like pollution from like the smoke coming out of the chimneys. Now, ever since I've like been going to this school and like just familiarizing myself with the environment, I'm always like in my head comparing like the Bronx and Manhattan.
Students actually experience the process that scientists have to go through in communicating data that could be potentially dry and uninteresting in one perspective, but they can turn it into a narrative that engages a public audience. So it makes students feel powerful in that they can use their data to make meaningful change.
We have 12 middle school students, 6th and 7th graders from public school West End Secondary School in my district.
The importance of these lessons on sustainability isn't lost on this class.
Climate change is a huge thing with everything going on in today's world. I feel so impacted by something like this just because we have to think about this is our future. I'm worried about what's going to happen. One person isn't going to change anything. We need a community to come together. If enough people do it, it will be able to make a change.
I'm Elaine Reyes at UN headquarters in New York. Thanks for being a UN Insider.